What would you do if you were treated unfairly just because someone thought you didn't deserve to be where you are? Ethan and Naomi, a young black couple, were enjoying their honeymoon when they encountered blatant disrespect from a flight attendant. Heather, emboldened by her uncle being the co-pilot, didn't just mock and insult them. She even tried to humiliate them in front of the entire first-class cabin. But when the truth was revealed that Ethan and Naomi were actually the owners of the airline, the entire flight was turned upside down. Could their dignity and composure change Heather's attitude and the perceptions of those who witnessed it? This is not just a story about injustice. It's a profound lesson about respect and kindness. Before we dive into the story, let us know where you're watching from. If you find this video engaging and meaningful, please support us with a like and subscribe to our channel to encourage us to bring you more emotional and inspiring stories. Now let's listen together. Morning sunlight streamed through the large glass panels of the international airport, casting a gentle golden glow on the polished floors. Ethan Bennett and Naomi Bennett stood hand in hand, their eyes sparkling with joy. This trip wasn't just an ordinary vacation. It was their long-awaited honeymoon, a promising journey to the stunning Caribbean shores. Naomi tilted her head, her deep, dark eyes gleaming mischievously as she whispered to her husband, "I bet you won't dare wear those floral shorts I bought for you." Ethan chuckled, his warm laugh resonating amidst the bustling crowd. "We'll see who's surprised, Mrs. Bennett," he replied, his tone playful yet tender. They approached the first-class check-in counter, where flight attendant Heather Collins stood with a polished demeanor. Heather, her blonde hair neatly tied back and a thin smile on her lips, glanced at the couple. Though her smile remained intact, her eyes scanned them like a spotlight searching for flaws. "Good morning," Ethan greeted, his tone polite but not overly effusive. He handed their tickets to Heather. Heather took the tickets, but instead of the usual swift glance, she paused, her gaze sweeping over them once more. "Flying first class? Are we?" she asked, her voice polite but tinged with subtle skepticism. Naomi furrowed her brow slightly but said nothing. Ethan smiled, maintaining his composed demeanor. "That's right. It's our honeymoon." Heather curled her lips slightly, but the smile didn't quite reach her eyes. Congratulations," she said, then began examining the tickets. Yet, rather than processing them efficiently, she flipped through the tickets repeatedly, as if searching for something out of place. Naomi couldn't hold back any longer. "Is there a problem?" she asked, her tone sharp yet controlled. "Oh, no," Heather replied, drawing out her words with a deliberate pause as she handed the tickets back. "I just wanted to make sure everything was in order." She glanced down at her computer screen, then looked at them once more. "Your flight is sure to be unforgettable." Ethan gently placed a hand on Naomi's shoulder, silently urging her to let it go. "Thank you. We're very much looking forward to it," he said with a calm smile. Heather nodded, but her gaze lingered on the couple as they walked away, as though she couldn't fully believe they belonged in first class. At the security checkpoint, the first taste of unfairness began to unfold. Ethan and Naomi approached the security area, where passengers ahead of them passed through quickly and without issue. But when it was their turn, a young security officer raised his hand, signaling them to stop. "Random screening," he said flatly, his voice devoid of emotion. Naomi froze in place. "Random screening? Why us?" she asked, her eyes narrowing. The officer shrugged, avoiding eye contact. "Just protocol, ma'am." Ethan stepped forward, his tone remaining calm and measured. "It's all right, Naomi. Let's just get through it and move on." But Naomi's patience began to wear thin as her bag was opened and her belongings were pulled out, each item scrutinized with unwarranted intensity. A small bottle of lotion was held up for inspection, and the officer declared it non-compliant, despite Naomi being certain it fell within the regulations. "This is my lotion," she said, her voice growing firm. "It's within the 100 milliliter limit." The security officer raised an eyebrow. "We'll need to take a closer look." Naomi turned to Ethan, but this time even he furrowed his brow. "Is there an issue? Everything we have complies with the rules." The officer didn't respond, simply shaking his head before reluctantly allowing them to proceed. Naomi let out a deep sigh as they walked away in silence, but the sting of dissatisfaction clung to her. Ethan gently squeezed her hand, offering quiet reassurance. I can't believe this, Naomi said, her eyes flashing with anger. What did we do to deserve being treated like this? Ethan shook his head. We didn't do anything wrong. Sometimes you don't have to. They'll still find a reason to judge you. Naomi didn't reply, but her eyes burned with a small, fiery defiance. The world shouldn't be this way. Ethan offered her a soft smile. It shouldn't. But you know what? We're not going to let this ruin our day. Naomi nodded, though the feeling of injustice lingered like a wound refusing to heal. The couple finally boarded the first-class cabin. Ethan and Naomi quickly found their seats, a comfortable corner with plush leather chairs and ample space. Naomi leaned back, trying to relax, but her mind couldn't let go of what had just happened. Heather entered the cabin, this time in her role as a flight attendant. Naomi couldn't help but notice the insincere smile plastered across her face. Heather stopped in front of their row, carrying a tray of drinks. "Welcome to first class," Heather said, her tone sweet but devoid of genuine warmth. "What can I get you to start your flight?" Ethan smiled. "We'll have water." Heather slammed 2 plastic cups onto the table in front of them, the water sloshing over the edges, then quickly turned away without saying another word. Naomi watched her go, her brow furrowing deeply. "Did you see that?" she asked quietly, her eyes fixed on Heather's retreating figure. Ethan nodded subtly. "I saw, but don't let her get to you." Naomi said nothing more, but deep down she knew this was just the beginning. The plane had taken off and reached cruising altitude. Sunlight streamed through the windows, casting a golden glow over the soft leather seats in the first-class cabin. Yet the serene elegance of the space did little to ease the unease steadily building inside Naomi. Heather reappeared, her smile now one that Naomi had started to view as forced rather than genuine. The young flight attendant seemed to linger longer with other passengers, chatting and laughing naturally. But every time she approached Ethan and Naomi, that smile would vanish, as though she'd shed it like a mask. Naomi leaned toward Ethan, her voice low but filled with frustration. "She's doing this on purpose. You see it, don't you?" Ethan, maintaining his usual calm demeanor, nodded slowly. "I see it, but you don't need to let her bother you." "Don't let her bother me?" Naomi asked, her voice quivering slightly with restrained anger. "You think we should just sit here and let her treat us this way?" Ethan didn't respond immediately. He reached out, taking Naomi's hand in his fingers gently stroking hers as though to soothe the fire within her. "We don't need to prove anything to anyone, Naomi. Let her actions speak for themselves." Naomi fell silent, but her eyes remained fixed on Heather as she continued attending to the other passengers. Her movements were graceful, her laughter light and pleasant, until she neared their row where the air seemed to shift, heavy with tension. Naomi clenched her hands into fists, her frustration mounting with each passing moment. When the meal service began, Heather returned with a tray of food. She said nothing, simply placing the trays on the table in front of Ethan and Naomi with a swift, almost dismissive motion. The sauce from Naomi's tray splattered onto the table, leaving a long streak behind. Naomi glanced at the stain, then looked up at Heather. "Aren't you going to clean that up?" Heather paused, her expression a mix of surprise and disdain. "Oh, sorry," she said, her tone icy, as though the apology was the hardest thing she'd ever had to say. But instead of reaching for a napkin, she simply stood there, waiting. Naomi leaned back in her seat, her gaze fixed firmly on Heather. "I guess that's a no." Heather shrugged. "If you need, I can call someone else to help." With that, she turned and walked away before Naomi could respond. Ethan reached for a napkin and quietly cleaned the table himself. His movements were calm, deliberate, but Naomi noticed the slight tension in his shoulders, a small but telling sign that he wasn't as unaffected as he appeared. "I can't believe this," Naomi said, her voice breaking the tense quiet between them. "She really thinks we don't belong here." "And that's exactly why we shouldn't react," Ethan replied, his tone steady, his eyes calm. "Because every time she behaves like this, she's proving it to herself, not to us." Naomi wanted to argue, wanted to raise her voice and call out the injustice, but deep down, she knew Ethan was right. Sometimes silence was a form of victory, even when the weight of injustice burned fiercely within her. As the flight continued, Heather's arrogance became increasingly evident. She strode through the cabin as though she owned the space, her demeanor commanding attention. While the other passengers said nothing, their expressions and body language suggested they noticed her attitude. Naomi observed Heather chatting with a passenger near the window. A snippet of their conversation reached her ears, enough to send a ripple of anger through her. "My uncle is the co-pilot on this flight," Heather said, her voice laced with pride and a touch of smugness. "Sometimes I just have to make sure everything runs as it should." Naomi turned to Ethan. "Did you hear that? That's why she thinks she has the right to act like this." Ethan nodded, his gaze drifting toward the clouds outside the window. "That explains a lot. But it doesn't justify anything," Naomi said firmly, her voice unwavering. When Heather returned to check their tickets once again, this time without any clear reason, Naomi couldn't stay silent. "What else do you need to check?" Naomi asked, her voice sharp, no longer restrained. Heather raised an eyebrow, her cold smile returning. "Just making sure, ma'am. I have to fulfill my responsibilities." "Your responsibility is to serve passengers, not to insult them," Naomi shot back, her tone cutting like a blade. Heather took a small step back, but her expression showed no remorse. "I'm just doing my job, ma'am," she said flatly. For the first time, Ethan looked up from his seat, his gaze steady and cold. His voice, however, remained calm. "Then I suggest you focus on doing your job well, instead of trying to prove something to us." Heather glared at them, her jaw tightening, but before she could respond, the voice of the captain rang out over the intercom. "Ladies and gentlemen, I have a special announcement." The plane soared high above the clouds, leaving behind a sea of cottony white that seemed to stretch endlessly. In the first-class cabin, everything appeared peaceful and pristine, except for Ethan and Naomi. Heather appeared once more, her cold gaze sweeping over the couple before landing on other passengers. Her demeanor transformed as she stopped to chat with an older gentleman a few rows ahead. She laughed loudly, her voice carrying through the cabin, as if to emphasize that only certain people deserved her warmth. But when she returned to Ethan and Naomi's row, the smile vanished, replaced by a sharp, disdainful look. "Would you like anything else?" Heather asked, but her tone lacked any trace of enthusiasm. Naomi looked up at her, her eyes sharp as daggers. "No, thank you," she replied, but there was something in her voice that made Heather pause for just a moment. Still, Heather quickly turned and walked away, leaving behind a chill in her wake. Naomi leaned toward Ethan, her voice dropping to a whisper. "Did you see that? She's not even trying to hide her contempt anymore." Ethan sat up straighter, his calm demeanor unshaken. "I see it," he said quietly, his eyes never leaving Naomi. "But don't let her get to you. We're here for ourselves, not to prove anything to her." Naomi folded her arms, her gaze following Heather, who was now standing at the front of the cabin, chatting animatedly with another passenger. "I understand," she murmured, her voice firm. "But she has no right to act this way." Meanwhile, Heather's voice carried through the cabin as she spoke to a middle-aged man seated by the aisle. Her laugh was overly confident, almost theatrical, as though she wanted everyone to hear. "My uncle is the co-pilot on this flight," Heather said proudly. "So, sometimes I have to make sure everything runs the way it should." The man nodded, seemingly impressed. Naomi clenched the armrest of her seat, her eyes blazing with anger. She turned to Ethan, her voice barely above a whisper, but sharp enough to cut through the noise. "That's why. She thinks she's in charge here." Ethan tilted his head slightly, his gaze soft yet contemplative. "Maybe so, but that doesn't justify the way she's behaving." Naomi didn't reply, but inside, a simmering anger boiled like a volcano on the verge of eruption. She wasn't one to let injustices go unchallenged, but for Ethan's sake, she held her composure. For now. Not long after, Heather returned. This time, she carried a food tray and slammed it onto Naomi's table. Sauce splattered out from the tray, leaving a long streak across the table. Heather said nothing, didn't apologize, and simply lifted the tray away as if it were a task she had been forced to complete. Naomi raised her eyes to meet Heather's, her voice low but firm. "Aren't you going to clean this up?" Heather paused, her gaze brushing past Naomi's without lingering, as though she couldn't even muster the effort to care. "If you need, I can call someone else to handle it," she replied coldly, her tone void of any goodwill. Naomi leaned back in her seat, her piercing stare fixed on Heather. "I think you understand exactly what I mean." Heather shrugged, making no attempt to act. She turned away, leaving Naomi to deal with it herself. Ethan silently picked up a napkin and wiped the sauce off the table. He said nothing, but Naomi could sense the tension in his movements, subtle but unmistakable. "She's doing this on purpose," Naomi said, her voice cracking slightly in the tight space between them. Ethan set the napkin down, his eyes meeting Naomi's with steady determination. "I know, but you don't have to let her win." Naomi was about to reply, but at that moment, Heather returned once again, this time with a request that pushed Naomi's patience past its breaking point. "I need to check your tickets again," Heather announced, her voice loud enough for the other passengers in the first-class cabin to hear. Naomi lifted her head, her eyes brimming with disbelief. "What else do you need to check? We already showed our tickets when we boarded." Heather arched an eyebrow, her icy smile unwavering. "Yes, but I just want to be certain." Naomi stood up, her gaze burning into Heather. "We've already proven we belong here, but it seems you still don't believe it. So what do you want me to do now? Call the captain for confirmation?" Heather didn't flinch. Instead, she crossed her arms over her chest, standing tall and composed. Her tone was frigid. "Ma'am, I'm simply doing my job, and I have the right to verify if I see fit." Naomi let out a sharp laugh, but there was no amusement in it. "Your job? Or are you just trying to flex your authority because your uncle is the co-pilot on this flight?" Heather hesitated briefly, but quickly regained her composure. "I'm not sure what you're implying," she said, her voice tight but still defiant. Naomi was about to retort when the captain's voice crackled over the intercom. "Ladies and gentlemen, I have a special announcement. It is with great honor that we welcome Mr. and Mrs. Ethan and Naomi Bennett, the new owners of Horizon Airlines, aboard this flight. Let's all extend our gratitude for their choice to fly with Horizon." The entire cabin fell into stunned silence. Naomi watched as Heather's face turned ghostly pale, her eyes widening in disbelief at what she'd just heard. Around them, passengers began murmuring, their astonished glances darting between the couple and Heather. Ethan sat quietly, his hand gently holding Naomi's as if to reassure her. Naomi leaned forward slightly, her confident smile now fully restored. This time, her words were delivered with calm authority. "Well, do you have anything else you'd like to check now?" Heather stood frozen, unable to speak. Her eyes darted between Naomi and Ethan, the arrogance that had once defined her expression now replaced by an unmistakable look of shock. She opened her mouth to say something, but the words caught in her throat. The air in the first-class cabin grew thick with tension. Passengers whispered among themselves, their curious and astonished gazes fixed on the couple. A middle-aged man seated nearby looked visibly puzzled. "They're really the owners," he murmured to the person beside him. Naomi didn't turn to acknowledge the murmurs or the stares. Her focus remained on Heather, as though waiting for the flight attendant to offer an explanation. But Heather remained motionless, her hands gripping the serving tray tightly, her face flushed as if she'd been caught red-handed. "Do you have nothing to say?" Naomi asked, her voice calm, yet each word cut like a blade. Heather took a deep breath, struggling to steady herself. I'm sorry," she stammered, her voice so faint it was nearly inaudible. "I didn't know." "You didn't know who we were," Naomi interrupted, her tone even, but weighted with meaning. "But that doesn't matter, Heather. Whether or not we own this airline is irrelevant. What matters is that you should have treated us and every other passenger with respect, no matter who they are." Heather remained still, her lips pressed tightly together. Nearby, a few passengers began nodding, as if Naomi's words had struck a chord with them. A young woman sitting by the window glanced at Naomi, then lowered her gaze, a look of guilt crossing her face, as though ashamed for not speaking up earlier. Ethan rose from his seat, his deep voice steady but firm. "Heather, we're not here to argue with you, but you need to understand that the disrespect you've shown doesn't just harm us. It reflects poorly on you as well." Heather swallowed hard, her voice trembling as she replied, "I truly apologize. I was wrong. I shouldn't have let my biases affect how I do my job." Naomi studied her for a moment, her gaze softening slightly. "That's right, you shouldn't have. But an apology alone isn't enough, Heather. What matters is what you do after this." Heather lowered her head, her cheeks burning red. "I understand. I'll do better." The tension in the cabin seemed to ease slightly, though the silence that followed was heavy, as if everyone was lost in their own thoughts about what had just transpired. An older man seated near the aisle turned to Ethan and Naomi, speaking softly. I'm sorry I didn't say anything. I should have spoken up when I saw how she was treating you. Naomi turned to him, her eyes gentle and kind. It's all right, but next time, if you see something wrong, speak up. Silence only makes the problem worse. The man nodded, his expression contemplative. As Heather walked away, the first-class cabin returned to a semblance of quiet. Ethan and Naomi sat back down, their hands still clasped together. Naomi looked at Ethan, a faint smile gracing her lips. We did what needed to be done. Ethan nodded, his gaze warm and resolute. Change begins with moments like this, and I think today we started something. Naomi leaned her head on his shoulder, her eyes gazing out the window at the expansive sky, a wide-open canvas filled with the promise of better days ahead. The plane surged forward, carrying not just the passengers, but the lessons and messages left in its wake. Their story wouldn't end here, but today, they knew they had done the right thing. When the plane landed, the first-class cabin remained steeped in an oppressive silence. Other passengers quietly gathered their belongings, their furtive glances aimed at Ethan and Naomi, though no one dared to speak. Heather, who had maintained an outward facade of composure throughout the flight, now stood at the door to bid farewell to the passengers, her awkwardness unmistakable. As Ethan and Naomi approached, Naomi's gaze briefly flicked toward Heather. Goodbye, Miss Heather, Naomi said, her voice light but loaded with meaning. I hope this flight left a lasting impression on all of us. Heather bowed her head, her lips parting as if to speak, but no words came. Ethan gave her a slight nod before he and Naomi stepped off the plane. The radiant light of the late afternoon spilled through the airport's glass walls, as though attempting to wash away the tension of the flight. Naomi exhaled deeply, as if trying to leave the entire ordeal behind, but Ethan could sense that echoes of the experience still lingered within her. At the baggage claim area, they were met by a sharply dressed man in a black suit, one of Horizon Airlines' senior managers. He bowed respectfully, his expression filled with remorse. Mr. and Mrs. Bennett, on behalf of Horizon Airlines, I extend our sincerest apologies for the unacceptable experience you endured on today's flight, he said, his tone formal but genuine. We received a report from the captain regarding the incident. Naomi fixed him with a piercing gaze. What I want to know is what you plan to do to ensure this never happens again, not just to us, but to anyone. The manager nodded, his face solemn. We are conducting an internal investigation and will take appropriate action. Miss Heather will be given a formal reprimand, and we will ensure that our entire team undergoes additional training to uphold standards of professionalism and fairness. Ethan stepped forward, his steadfast resolve evident in his expression. We're not interested in empty apologies. What matters are the actions you take next. Make sure no one else has to go through what we just did. The manager bowed even lower. Understood. I assure you, Horizon Airlines will not let you down. Naomi said nothing further. She looked at Ethan, and together they walked out of the airport. The vast open space outside greeted them with a boundless blue sky, a silent promise of brighter days ahead. Elsewhere in the airport, Heather sat in the crew office, her head bowed. Her uncle, the flight's co-pilot, stood before her, his expression stern and unyielding. What were you thinking, Heather? He asked, his voice sharp and devoid of sympathy. I didn't think, Heather began, but her uncle cut her off. You didn't think? That's exactly the problem, he said, his voice lowering but no less firm. You let your biases cloud your judgment, and now the entire airline is dealing with the fallout. Heather kept her head down, her eyes red and teary. I didn't mean to. I just didn't believe. You don't need to believe who they are to treat them with basic respect, he interrupted. And now, you have to face the consequences. Consider this a lesson. If you don't change, there will no longer be a place for you here. Heather didn't respond, but deep inside, a heavy sense of regret began to take root. She knew she had been wrong, but the question lingered. Would she truly change, or would she simply continue to find excuses? The flight was over, but its lessons echoed far beyond the confines of the cabin. For everyone involved, it marked a turning point, one that carried the promise of reflection, growth, and perhaps redemption. Ethan and Naomi sat in the back seat of the taxi taking them to their hotel. Naomi rested her head on Ethan's shoulder, her eyes gazing out the window as towering buildings gradually gave way to the serene blue coastline. "Do you think they'll truly change?" she asked softly, her voice laced with introspection. Ethan gave her hand a gentle squeeze, his eyes sparkling with quiet conviction. "No one changes overnight, but if each of us does our part, the world will gradually become a better place." Naomi smiled, her expression tender and filled with hope. "I suppose that's why I love you. You always believe, even when the world gives us every reason to doubt." Ethan tilted his head, his own smile mirroring hers. "And you're the reason I'll never stop believing." Outside, the sun began to set, painting the sky in vivid hues of gold and red. Their honeymoon journey had yet to truly begin, but Ethan and Naomi knew they had already been on a much greater journey, one of resilience and faith. They held each other's hands tightly, letting the golden rays of dusk carry their hopes for a more just and beautiful future. And so, the story of Ethan and Naomi comes to a close, not just a flight, but a profound lesson in respect and dignity. They showed us that even in the face of injustice, composure and self-respect remain the greatest tools for overcoming it. Without raising their voices, Ethan and Naomi's actions resonated deeply, challenging not only Heather, but everyone around them to reflect and change. Their journey reminds us that the world will only improve if each of us chooses kindness and fairness, even in the smallest moments. Silence in the face of injustice only worsens the problem. So, be the one who speaks up. Be the one who spreads kindness, even with the smallest of actions. If this story inspired you, share it with others. Don't forget to hit like, subscribe, and turn on notifications to catch more meaningful stories like this on Stories About Kindness. Together, let's write more stories of kindness and change the world, one action at a time.